Art, literature, and philosophy are attempts to found the world anew on a human freedom, that of the creator. Simone de Beauvoir. Suppose you were writing a work of social philosophy. Shouldn't be too much of a stretch, I imagine, for all you brilliant folks out there. And one of the main points you're making is that certain kinds of artistic expression are dangerous to the public and have no place in a well-ordered society. Okay, that second part may be a bit more of a stretch, but just imagine it for the sake of argument. If this is the point you're trying to make, how might you frame this? How might you state your case? I suppose there are a lot of possibilities, but there are a few things that you almost certainly would not do. To begin with, you probably wouldn't embed your argument within the framework of a dramatic dialogue. You wouldn't open the book with a wistful discourse on the ambiguities of aging that is only tangentially related to the body of your argument. You wouldn't thread literary motifs and devices through the work. And you certainly wouldn't take a long aside to construct a dramatic allegory expressing the epistemic underpinnings of your philosophical dispositions. Yet all this is exactly what Plato does in his most famous and influential work, The Republic. In case you haven't read it or it's been a while, The Republic progresses through a long series of questions and answers between Socrates and various interlocutors. They discuss, among other things, the nature of justice and the proper ordering of a just society. They arrive at a utopian vision of a state led by a philosopher king, philosophy being the highest and purest human enterprise in their view. Along the way, they banish certain artistic endeavors, in particular dramatic poetry and performance. I'll get into the reasoning behind this prohibition in the next episode. For now, it's enough for us to know that certain kinds of art are forbidden. The Republic is also the source of the Allegory of the Cave, the brilliant dreamlike fabulation that set me off on this whole episodes-long line of inquiry, and which basically established the principal motif for all of Western philosophy, and which might itself be the kind of tale that would end up censored in the ideal republic that Socrates describes in the book. It's always struck me as odd that a work which is famously hostile to artistic expression, or at the very least suspicious of the social and moral impact of certain kinds of art, would itself rely so heavily on literary and dramatic devices to convey its message. A philosopher and media theorist Marshall McLuhan tells us that the medium is the message. Now, Plato was around a couple thousand years too early to read McLuhan's work, but I imagine he was sharp enough to gather that framing his works, all of his works, not just The Republic, as dramatic dialogues might suggest that there is something inherent to the format, the craft, the artistry, that could not be conveyed through the kind of univocal syllogistic reasoning that would typify the work of his successor, Aristotle. Plato was a pretty smart guy. Surely he had to realize that there was some tension, if not an outright contradiction, between the medium of his work and its message. He couldn't have just missed that, right? So what was going on? Did Plato have a blind spot when it came to his own stylistic indulgences? Did he, like Whitman, have a great tolerance for paradox? Or was he up to something else? I'm Greg Beam, and this is Quite Useless. Welcome to Quite Useless, a podcast about art and its role in our lives. I often use this program as an opportunity to delve into the philosophy of art, to take a philosophical look at various topics in the arts. For this episode, I'm flipping that approach on its head and looking at the art of philosophy. I started off with a question about Plato, and don't worry, we'll come back to our fine Greek friend. But first, let's fast forward a couple thousand years to look at another thinker whose work might shed some light on the subject. France, 1927. A young woman named Simone de Beauvoir, about to begin her studies at the Sorbonne, wrote in her diary, "I don't want my life to obey any other will but my own." She was only 19 years old, and she was living at a time when women were not typically encouraged to dream big and march to the beat of their own drummer. But while other young women were jotting down breathless entries about their crushes on Rudolph Valentino and what they were going to wear to the Bastille Day parade, this force of nature was penning missives asserting her commitment to self-determination. 40 years later, the middle-aged de Beauvoir, by then the author of several acclaimed works of fiction, memoir, and what came to be known as the Bible of feminism, would write in her autobiography, "I tore myself away from the safe comfort of certainties through my love for truth, and truth rewarded me." Around the same time, she stated in an interview, "I envy no one. I am perfectly happy with life as it is. If I had to start my life all over again, I would not make it otherwise." This confirms that she had lived up to the lofty and pure aim she had set for herself as a student decades earlier. She had lived on her own terms in concert with her unflappable standards for the conduct of a good life, the chief requirement being the personal freedom she had insisted upon and consistently won for herself. The picture emerging here is a person who possesses an abundance of self-esteem or self-rapport, as de Beauvoir herself called it. And there is little doubt, looking at both her writings and her life, that she was rather self-assured, audacious, we might even say. In an intellectual environment dominated by men, she asserted herself and her ideas, never kowtowing or taking any guff from anyone, as she became one of the preeminent European intellectuals of the 20th century. De Beauvoir famously maintained a decades-long open relationship with Jean-Paul Sartre at a time when even cohabitating outside of wedlock was a major taboo. Her letters later revealed she had routinely engaged in passionate affairs with other men and women. And all the while, she adamantly defended her decisions and her right to make them, and argued fiercely for the necessity of reshaping society to allow and to encourage all women to do the same. This is not a shrinking violet, to put it mildly. De Beauvoir boldly and insightfully laid out the philosophical underpinnings of feminist thought in her seminal work, The Second Sex, the aforementioned Bible of feminism. She built her argument on the ethics of existentialism, a philosophical movement most closely associated with Sartre, but which de Beauvoir made important contributions to herself. Her second major philosophical work, The Ethics of Ambiguity, comes closer, I think, than Sartre ever did to responding to a theological critique of existentialism, namely how ethical principles are possible within an order circumscribed by the boundaries of human action and lacking any appeal to a transcendental authority. All this is to say that, along with her impressive bibliography of fiction and memoir, de Beauvoir made major contributions to the field of philosophy. This should come as no surprise. It was a field of study that had captivated her since she was a teenager. She studied philosophy at the Sorbonne, graduating just behind Sartre, and at 21, she was the youngest person ever to pass the final exam. She wrote in 1958, "The thing that attracted me about philosophy was that it went straight to the essentials. I had always wanted to know everything. Philosophy would appease this desire, for it aimed at total reality. Philosophy went right to the heart of truth." As someone who studied philosophy in college myself, I get what she's talking about here. It's a bit surprising, then, that for all of her philosophical predilections and major philosophical work, de Beauvoir didn't consider herself to be a philosopher. In an interview near the end of her life, she said, "I am not a philosopher, but a literary writer. Sartre is the philosopher." This seems odd. Why wouldn't de Beauvoir want to call herself a philosopher as well as a literary writer? Why did she feel the need to make this distinction and to circumscribe her work in the way she did? It wasn't that she didn't engage in philosophical scholarship and discourse. She did. It wasn't that she hadn't written significant works of philosophy. She had. And it clearly wasn't that she lacked the confidence to adopt whatever designation she felt best fit her, or that she was given to false modesty. She didn't, and she wasn't. So what was the hang-up? The issue seems to have been with a specific, narrow view of what it meant to be a philosopher. De Beauvoir came up within an intellectual tradition that regarded philosophers as people, let's be honest, as men, who built elaborate, comprehensive systems of thought, cosmologies, we might call them. Thinkers like Aquinas, Spinoza, Hume, Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, and more recently Husserl, Heidegger, and de Beauvoir's own paramour Sartre had all sought grand unifying theories. Theories of everything, which would explain existence and our place in it with impenetrable logical precision. They prided themselves on being thorough, exacting, and, in most cases, extraordinarily dull. I mean, seriously, have you ever actually read Spinoza or Hegel? For guys who are sometimes described as pantheistic quasi-mystics, their prose is lethal. And don't even get me started on Kant. Boy. Schopenhauer is a noteworthy exception to the rule here. His writing is comparatively straightforward and even lively at times, and he injects it with ample doses of acerbic humor. But Schopenhauer may be the exception that proves the rule. For the most part, these guys wrote as though the aim of philosophy were to bring about the collapse of the reader's brain under the weight of its boredom and frustration. It wasn't that none of them had any artistic sensibility or talent. Sartre is as famous for his plays and fiction as he is for his academic writing. But when he was functioning as a philosopher, it was another story. He was operating under an intellectual prejudice that had taken root in philosophy centuries earlier, a tendency that found its apotheosis in what came to be called analytic philosophy. In short, philosophers had for some time been moving toward turning philosophy into a science, with all the clinical rigor and reliability of biology, chemistry, or physics. Bertrand Russell, one of the founders of analytic philosophy, had the notion that a philosophy of any given topic exists only for so long as there lacks a reliable science of that topic. With sufficient developments in science, then, philosophy would eventually become obsolete. Russell went so far as to write, "Whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods, and what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know." This is the tradition that had been handed down to Simone de Beauvoir, and it was because she accepted the terms set by this tradition regarding what did and did not constitute philosophy that she would not identify herself as a philosopher. She once said, "The idea of a philosophical career seemed wildly exciting, but only if one was bitten by a theory of one's own. Expounding other people's beliefs, developing, judging, collating, and criticizing them, no, I failed to see the attraction of this. How can one resign oneself to being the disciple of anybody? I possessed far too much intellectual ambition to let this satisfy me. I wanted to communicate the element of originality in my own experience. In order to do this successfully, I knew it was literature towards which I must orientate myself. I wanted to communicate the element of originality in my own experience. In order to be original and independent and to honor her own experience, all imperatives for her, she had to focus on literature rather than philosophy. Because, of course, philosophy looked to her like a quasi-scientific rather than an artistic pursuit. It was a field in which comprehensive systems reigned rather than the creative expression of ideas, and again, of one's own experience. It was because Simone de Beauvoir accepted the terms handed down to her concerning what made a philosopher that she didn't regard herself as one. The thing is, why shouldn't there be modes of philosophical inquiry and discourse other than the analytic? Contemplative modes, literary, poetic, narrative, personal modes. It strikes me that the conventional European view of philosophy, which de Beauvoir accepted, was markedly masculine, even phallocentric, in its sensibility. The philosopher penetrating their subject and thrusting their models into the world. Jumping tracks here a bit. In her wonderful book, 100 Essays I Don't Have Time to Write, playwright Sarah Ruhl recounts hearing a young male student describe the structure of his play. Well, first it starts out, then it speeds up, and it's going, and then bam, it's over. Reflecting on this, Ruhl asks, do we think the arc is a natural structure because of the structure of the male orgasm? Consider what the author is doing with this observation. With one question, she upends the foundational presuppositions that underlie classical linear narration, commonly called climactic narration. a paradigm first and most famously codified by Aristotle in his Poetics. Rule sees the Aristotelian narrative model for what it is, a single, admittedly successful mode of storytelling that disingenuously postures as the only effective mode of storytelling. The ruse here has been so successful, so pathogenic, we might even say, that just about every book you can read on Hollywood screenwriting today is little more than a variation on Aristotle. And I might also note that the long march toward analytic philosophy begins with Aristotle as well. Was Aristotle onto something in analyzing the narrative patterns of popular plays as he did? Sure. He had a lot of great insights. But, as Sarah Ruhl points out in another essay, we don't have to accept the terms of his argument. She doesn't. She's a really good playwright. The Aristotelian paradigm is powerful and effective, but there are other ways to do it. Ruhl's plays, which are among the most lovely and lauded works of the contemporary American theater, don't follow Aristotelian patterns. There are alternative approaches. It's easy to become benighted by tradition, to get coaxed or conned into thinking that the customary way of doing something or looking at something is the only way. This is the meaning of the initial condition in the Allegory of the Cave. The prisoners believe that what they see on the wall of the cave is all there is, because it's all they've ever seen. Sarah Ruhl, in her little book of essays, does the work of leading the reader out of the cave with respect to received notions about drama. De Beauvoir, in her own way, engaged in a similar project, shedding light on the unjustifiable subjugation of women in society. But she stopped short of questioning the manner in which philosophy, the field she had always aspired to work in, was supposed to be done. She accepted, regarding the work itself, that the walls of the cave were her only canvas, and that she simply wasn't equipped to work in this way. I can't help wondering what might have happened, the revolution that she might have spawned in the field of philosophy, had de Beauvoir rejected these fundamental assumptions about how the work was to be conducted. What if she had proposed that literary writing could indeed be a modality of philosophy, and that her own literary works, both fiction and memoir, constituted philosophical literature? She accepted the twin fangs of system building and scientific reasoning as the only legitimate ways to practice philosophy. What if instead she had said, "No, I don't buy it. You position this as the only way, but it is not the only way"? Well, okay. As a historical reality, she likely would have been shunned by the arbiters of the field she was attempting to work in. She might have been banned from the academy. But it's possible that she might have remained a cult figure, influencing a generation of thinkers not only on the role of women in society, but on the very mechanisms by which we think what we think. She might have led legions of young readers out of the cave of conventional philosophical thought. De Beauvoir wouldn't have had to look too far to find antecedents in this divergent approach to philosophy. A century earlier, and a few countries over, Soren Kierkegaard called into question the cohesiveness of Hegelian dialectics, and he did so using literary devices. He published his books under a variety of pseudonyms, each expressing a different philosophical viewpoint. The content is sometimes nested as journal entries or letters, a well-known convention of the popular epistolary novels of the time. It wasn't just that Kierkegaard was trying to lend his works a degree of literary or dramatic flair. These weren't just costumes for his arguments, no. The devices are essential to how he communicates his ideas. His whole ontology of ambiguity, that certain oppositions are eternally unbridgeable, a precursor to de Beauvoir's ethics of ambiguity, could not be adequately expressed in the form of a logical argument. The medium is the message. Had Kierkegaard adopted the form of Hegel's arguments, he would have already ceded ground to Hegel's worldview. He needed alternative forms to not only express his ideas, but to embody them. It isn't just that his ideas come through more forcefully because of the literary mode he writes in. They wouldn't come through at all, not in their authentic form, if he didn't operate in this mode. For Friedrich Nietzsche, the aesthetic dimension was fundamental to his whole worldview and his manner of conducting philosophical inquiry. I quoted him saying in the first season, It is only as an aesthetic phenomenon that the universe can be justified. Philosophical inquiry for Nietzsche was an artistic pursuit, and he seemed to regard any philosophical approach that didn't treat it as such as misaligned with its object of study. Questions of being and knowledge, right and wrong, cannot be disentangled from aesthetic questions. Any meaningful encounter with the world involves the experience of wonder, fascination, beauty, creativity, and creation, along with creative destruction, all of which are native to the province of art. And Nietzsche's writing itself captures this. It is as alluring and fascinating for the elegance and power and beauty of his prose as it is for his ideas. Nor did Nietzsche regard literature as the only artistic medium capable of carrying a philosophical payload. He was an amateur composer, and music for him was primary to the human experience. He confesses, "I cannot distinguish between tears and music." Elsewhere he writes, "Without music, life would be a mistake." Dancing, likewise, forms a central motif in his philosophy. Echoing the last phase of the Allegory of the Cave, he writes, "Those who are seen dancing are thought to be insane by those who cannot hear the music." Nietzsche also tells us, "You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star." By lifting the notion of creative disorder, Nietzsche was preemptively rejecting the logical positivism that would develop a few decades later. A sibling to analytic philosophy, logical positivism was also influenced by the work of Bertrand Russell. Like Russell, Nietzsche wanted to engage in a kind of science, but he opted for what he called a gay or joyful science, writing brief aphorisms with the dynamic, sanguine energy that typifies the dialogues of Socrates. Indeed, Nietzsche referred to himself as a tragic Socrates. The tragic, as I mentioned in discussing Artaud a couple of episodes ago, was for Nietzsche the highest mode of living. In order to live this way, one would have to frame one's life and all of one's endeavors, the exercise of philosophy included, as art. Art is the great stimulus to life, Nietzsche tells us. In art, man enjoys himself as perfection. For Nietzsche, philosophy was not an academic pursuit, but a practical one. It was the mechanism by which he negotiated his way of living. For him, the only sensible way of living was to regard one's life as a work of art. In this, he found a strong precedent in the ancient Greeks, whether he wanted to admit it or not. He liked to give Socrates a lot of guff, but what they shared was an affinity for weaving their philosophy, both its content and its conduct, into the fabric of their lives. For Socrates, a philosophy was a living, breathing pursuit. He didn't want his dialogues to be written down, his ideas codified, ossified, robbed of their vitality. Plato, it would seem, betrayed him in this. Nietzsche, though he did commit his ideas to paper and even self-published them, expresses a similar mistrust of the written word in the final passage of Beyond Good and Evil. Alas, what are you then, my written and painted thoughts? It's not so long ago that you were still so colorful, young, and malicious, full of stings and secret seasonings, so that you made me sneeze and laugh. And now? You have already stripped off your novelty, and some of you, I fear, are ready to become truths. You already look so immortal, so heartbreakingly honest, so boring. What are the only things we are capable of painting? Alas, always only what is just about to fade and is beginning to lose its fragrance. Alas, always only storms which are worn out and withdrawing, and old yellow feelings. Alas, always only birds which have exhausted themselves flying and lost their way and now let themselves be caught by our hand. We immortalize what can no longer live and fly, only tired and crumbling things. And it is only your afternoon, my written and painted thoughts, for which I alone have colors. Many colors, perhaps, many colorful caresses and 50 yellows and browns and greens and reds. But no one will sense from me how you looked in your dawn, you sudden sparks and miracles of my loneliness. You, my old loved ones, my wicked thoughts. Socrates likewise understood the problem with trying to pin down ideas that find their true expression in motion, that flourish and remain supple in the dynamic play of thought, and dry up and harden when they are set down on the page. Which is why he insisted on keeping his philosophy a living, fluid practice. But if Plato betrayed Socrates in this, Aristotle was the traitor par excellence. He was committed to ascertaining and documenting these truths that Nietzsche refers to so derisively. He wanted to streamline and codify the systems and bodies of knowledge covered by philosophy. In short, Aristotle wanted to convert philosophy from an art to a science. We see this even in his work on art, the Poetics, in which he makes the first documented attempt to systematize the chaotic, ineffable process of artistic creation and reception. Aristotle set the tone for the next 2 millennia of Western thought. Say what you want about postmodernism, for all the apparent looniness and illogic swirling around us, we still operate in a basically Aristotelian paradigm. It didn't used to be that way. Socrates was not alone among the ancients in approaching philosophy as a living, artistic pursuit. Diogenes of Sinope, sometimes called Diogenes the Cynic, fully embodied, fully lived his philosophy. Rather than the kind of misanthropic distrust that the term suggests today, ancient cynicism referred to a disdain for material things, living simply and in accordance with nature. In this way, it was an analog both to the Eastern traditions of Taoism and Buddhism and a predecessor to early Christianity. And Diogenes was its prophet, as much in the way he lived as in the words that came out of his mouth. He rejected the trappings of society, living among feral dogs and shitting out in the open. And he didn't do this discreetly. He publicly displayed his lifestyle as a kind of performance art. It's said that Diogenes once carried an illuminated lantern through a city square in the broad sunlight. When asked what he was doing, he said he was searching for an honest man, the implication being that none could be found. Diogenes may be most famous, however, for his solvitur ambulando, or solution by walking, when presented with Zeno's paradoxes of motion. For example, how can a person ever move from one spot to another if they first have to cover half the distance, then half of the remaining distance, and so on forever into infinitesimal divisions? Diogenes responded by getting up, walking to another spot, and then walking back. Actions for him spoke louder than words, and the conventional mode of discursive philosophy preferred by the dishonest men surrounding him led to confusion and everyone getting tied up in intellectual knots. He philosophized not by thinking, speaking, or writing, but by doing. And he didn't just live his philosophy, he performed it. Around the same time in China, the Taoist master Zhuang Zhou was creating absolutely madcap philosophical fables meant to engage the reader or listener in revelatory mental exercises. I drew on his work in the first episode of this season, The Use of the Useless. Zhuang Zhou's stories work like elaborate versions of those minimalist masterpieces of philosophical insight and perplexity, the Zen koan. The philosophy of Pyrrho of Elis also has strong parallels with Buddhist thought and Zen practices. In fact, Pyrrho may have been introduced to the tenets of Eastern skepticism, withholding judgment and observing the indeterminacy of all things, while traveling to India with the armies of Alexander the Great. Like Socrates, Pyrrho didn't write any of his ideas down, but rather lived and engaged with them through conversation and action. Like so many of the Greeks, he was ultimately concerned with the question of eudaimonia, living well. He sought a state of ataraxia, freedom from mental disturbance, akin to the Buddhist notion of nirvana. As in Zen Buddhism, this condition is not about discovering the right concepts. Rather, it may be achieved only by transcending concepts and categories. The words used in the practice may point the way, but they are not the way itself. One must not mistake the map for the terrain, or the pointing finger for the moon. In ancient skepticism, as in Zen Buddhism, enlightenment comes not through thought, but through practice. It comes through what modern Buddhist Thich Nhat Hanh calls the art of living. For these ancient thinkers, and many others, Philosophy was not something to be consigned to the classroom and engaged in by experts who would log their findings in abstruse journals and databases, only to be accessed and understood by other specialists. It was meant to be integrated into human life and society. For Socrates and Plato, like Diogenes, Pyrrho, and Zhuang Zhou, philosophy was about nothing less than the art of living. It should come as no surprise, then, that Socrates' philosophy is delivered to us by way of Plato in an artistic mode. There are many ways for us to do philosophy. The emphasis on the analytic in recent decades is something I think a philosopher like Nietzsche might interpret as the psychological propensity of certain scholars, who have gained dominance in the field, to impose their will to certainty on others. Bertrand Russell was wrong in supposing that there is an inevitable unidirectional progression to philosophical thought. In the conclusion of Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard points out that by attempting to progress beyond the insights of earlier thinkers, newer philosophers may end up circling back around to a less advanced position. In my view, this is the case with Russell and the analytic and positivist philosophers. In attempting to go beyond skepticism, they end up right back in the position of false certainty being refuted by Pyrrho, Diogenes, and Zhuang Zhou. And the work of Simone de Beauvoir, yes, I've been planning to come back to her all along, may itself stand as a kind of refutation of the monopoly of analysis and system building in philosophy. In her brief book about de Beauvoir, philosopher Liddell McWhorter proposes that de Beauvoir's identification as a literary writer might be understood as a philosophical stance. In keeping with her reputation as a feminist author, de Beauvoir put it in gendered terms, writing that women are not prone to the type of obsession that gripped the male philosophers she knew. But this stance may also have been strategic. By calling herself a philosopher, she would have been accepting the terms of the argument upheld by the dominant voices in the field and inviting rebuke from the arbiters of that domain. By refusing to capitulate to the conventional mode of philosophizing that her partner Sartre embodied at the time, de Beauvoir was quietly protesting. She was offering an alternative. And the fact that she didn't call her work philosophy may have allowed it to fly under the radar, attracting a larger readership and less pushback than if she had come out guns blazing, declaring her intention to rearrange the borders surrounding what we consider philosophy. Later in the 20th century, the American poet and essayist Audre Lorde would follow a similar literary path to the one cut by de Beauvoir, creating work that has implicit philosophical content, though she didn't find it useful to label it as philosophy. Lorde worked largely in the mode of personal narrative in both her poems and her essays. She examined the events and circumstances of her own life, focusing on the complexities and challenges she ran into as a black lesbian mom, and inductively drawing broader insights from these investigations. For her, even more than for de Beauvoir, philosophy had to be embodied in the personal experience of the one doing it. It's a process of finding not just personal freedom, but one's own voice. It's a process of replacing the words that are given to you with your own words, expressive of your authentic encounter with the world. Until these words are found, the mind remains bound up in the oppression and prejudices of both history and the current world order. Lorde writes, "What are the words you do not yet have? What do you need to say? What are the tyrannies you swallow day by day and attempt to make your own until you will sicken and die of them?" Each of us occupies our own cave, and each of us has the potential to emerge from that cave into the light of revelation. While we may share aspects of our ignorance with others, it isn't uniform or monolithic. Lorde was striving to cast off the language of oppression, racism, sexism, homophobia, and she had a personal stake in doing so that I will never experience. This emphasis on the personal is itself a philosophical position. Lorde once said to an audience, "Each of us is here right now because in one way or another we share a commitment to language, and to the power of language, and to the reclaiming of that language that had been made to work against us. For those of us who write, it is necessary to scrutinize not only the truth of what we speak, but the truth of that language by which we speak it. For others, it is to share and spread also those words that are meaningful to us, but primarily for us all, it is necessary to teach by living and speaking those truths which we believe and know beyond understanding. Because in this way alone, we can survive. By taking part in a process of life that is creative and continuing, that is growth. For Lorde, the cave from which she was ever trying to escape, and which she enjoined her sisters to escape, was largely one of language. In essays like "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House," she introduced many of the terms and processes for dismantling oppressive linguistic systems that have caught fire in contemporary American progressivism. This process for her was both collective and highly individualized. As a society, she proposed, we needed to lift the voices of people in marginalized groups, but it wouldn't look the same for every member of any given group. Nor do these groups I'm talking about have well-defined borders. Lorde wrote, "There is no such thing as a single-issue struggle, because we do not lead single-issue lives." And that is why speaking one's truth was a critical part of the process, both to engage in the process oneself and for all to be able to behold the rich diversity of human experience. Audre Lorde was engaging in yet another mode of philosophy, the mode of personal expression. Simone de Beauvoir did some of this as well, writing several memoirs and an autobiography, but Lorde, I think, took it to another level. Just as there is no such thing as a single-issue struggle, there is no such thing as a work of art that is purely personal or poetic or political or philosophical, because these dimensions of thought and experience are bound up together in our lives. Every personal expression is at the same time an expression of an ideological and philosophical orientation, and vice versa. There is no escaping it. The personal is philosophical, even if the speaker is not conscious of this fact. The trick is to realize this and to proceed consciously. For Audre Lorde, this could be a messy process. The creation of art for her was not a linear one. Echoing Nietzsche, she writes, "It is sometimes both the curse and the blessing of the poet to perceive without yet being able to order those perceptions. And that is another name for chaos. But of course, it is out of chaos that new worlds are born." Lorde wrote that an important function of poetry was to give name to the nameless. In one classic Zen koan, a monk struggles for years to learn the sound of one hand clapping. He is looking for the sound of the soundless. I opened this season with a quotation from Zhuang Zhou, calling upon us to discover the use of the useless. All of these apparent paradoxes go to the heart, I think, of what we're doing when we make or partake of art, or philosophy. And they speak once again to the project described by Plato in the Allegory of the Cave. While our individual caves may have different features and contours, the common element is that we are all trying to transcend categories and concepts, whichever mode of philosophy we are drawn to. We're trying to see beyond our own mental borders, to rise out of our inherited and habitual limitations. For me, art may be the most immediate and accessible gateway into this kind of process. When we connect with an image, sound, or text, it captivates the mind and the heart, undermines our defenses, and lays bare our spirit. And it does so by snatching us out of the realm of appearances and placing us in, or at least adjacent to, the ineffable foundation of our being. If I might indulge in my own bit of paradox, when we truly engage with art, it allows us to awaken out of a dream by awakening into one. This episode of Quite Useless was written, produced, performed, edited, mixed, and mastered by me, Greg Beam. This is not a single-issue podcast, and I am not a single-hyphenate host. A big thanks to Jordan Pascoe, who is an associate professor of philosophy at Manhattan College, for recommending the work of Audre Lorde to me. She also had some other wonderful suggestions that I unfortunately wasn't able to work into the episode. This is the third in a series I'm putting out, riffing on Plato's Allegory of the Cave. If you missed the first two, Raising the Curtain, Lifting the Veil, and Madmen, feel free to go back and check them out. The next episode will be the final one in my series about Plato's Allegory of the Cave and the final episode of the season, so check that out as well. I'm Greg Beam, and I very much hope you'll join me for more artistic, philosophical, and always quite useless adventures.